Matthew, the 18th chapter, is one that we've looked at quite a bit recently, where the disciples come to Jesus and ask once again, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That's a question they seem to ask quite often. And he calls a child to himself, and he says, you have to turn and become like this child, or you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's vital for our salvation that we have to turn and become like this child. He then emphasizes in verse 4 that you have to humble yourself like this child. That's the one who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So, how important is it that we become children? It's vital. The next statement that he makes in verse 5 is, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. So often we forget that very often how we treat others is a reflection of how we're treating Jesus or receiving Jesus. And probably the first thing that comes to our mind when we think of that is that great judgment scene in Matthew, the 25th chapter, where he separates the sheep and the goats, and on one side he says, you fed me and you clothed me and you visited me in prison, and said, when did you do it to me? And what is his answer? If you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And of course, it was the opposite on the other side, that they hadn't done those things. What does it mean to receive a child? What are we talking about with that? Understand, the gospel message is a message for all mankind. I think Peter is a great example of that struggle. I want you to turn with me to Acts, the 10th chapter. In Acts, the 10th chapter, the time has come for the message of the gospel to start going out to the Gentiles. And so the one who gets this privilege is going to be Peter, and Cornelius is chosen as the one who is going to receive that message. And Cornelius receives a message, and he sends for Peter. And while Peter is waiting there, he goes up on a rooftop, and he's going to be praying to God, and he has a vision. And that vision is one that's probably really familiar to all of us, where the sheet comes down from heaven, and it has all kinds of animals and reptiles and birds of the air, animals that the Jews were not allowed to eat. Okay, that's key. They were very careful about following those laws. And the voice from heaven that said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter's response is, "By no means, Lord, for I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean." It takes a lot of commitment to say to a voice from heaven, "No, I'm not going to do what you said." That tells us how serious Peter was about keeping this aspect of the law. Of course, the message from heaven says, what God has made clean, do not call common. That vision happened 3 times. So we're told that after the vision happens 3 times, the men that are coming from Cornelius arrive at Simon the tanner's house, and Peter goes down, and he's trying to understand what this message means. So he's still trying to make the connection of what's happening in this. And the Spirit comes to him and says, 3 men are looking for you. Go down and accompany them without hesitation. That's in verse 20. I just want you to draw your attention to that thought. Accompany them without hesitation. These are Gentiles that work with Cornelius, that are under his command. And there has to be a part of reason why the Spirit says to him, go without hesitation. Because if Gentiles came to a Jew and said, we want you to go with us, what would they do? I'm not sure I should do that, right? That understanding was so strong that when Jesus was on trial, the Jews would not enter into the palace of Pilate because then they would be unclean for partaking of the Passover. That was their way of thinking. They wouldn't hang around the Gentiles because just being in their presence was considered that made you unclean. So the Spirit has to say to Peter, go without hesitation. Don't even think about it. You just go. And so he does. He goes with them, and when he meets Cornelius, we're told in the 10th chapter, verses 28 and 29, that he gets the opportunity to teach the message to him. And it says in that passage, in verse 28, and he said to them, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a Jew to associate with or to visit anyone of another nation. See how serious this was? But God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. I asked then, why have you sent for me? So clearly Peter has gotten some thinking done at this point, right? But you'll notice he says, it's unlawful for me to have anything to do with a Gentile, associate or visit with them. What does he mean by unlawful? Every Jew was taught from the time that they were babies that if you go to the house of a Gentile, if you eat a meal with a Gentile, that's a violation of Jewish law. The problem is there's no law in the Old Testament that says they can't do that. When they say it was unlawful, what they mean is we've decided it's unlawful. And the way that they did that is it was kind of we see this as a part of the whole scope of God's plan for the people of Israel, that we're a separate people. And so in general, then, that means we can't associate with other people, and therefore it's unlawful. So understand, everything that Peter is coping with at this point is not unlawful as far as God is concerned. It's unlawful as far as the Jews are concerned. And it was a problem even for him at this point, that he's struggling with this. So this was so well known. He says, Cornelius, you know this is true. So those who were with Cornelius even understood Jews would not visit or talk to them. So an incredible thing has happened. And then he says, God showed me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So Peter got the point that whole vision about eating an unclean animal was not about eating unclean animals. It's about, how do I think of other people? And up to that point, what that means is that for most Jews, they thought of the Gentiles as common and unclean. And you don't associate with them. And he says, but because of that vision, God's saying, I can't think of people that way anymore. He said, I came without objection. I think it's interesting that now he's using that word objection. The Spirit said, don't hesitate. Peter says, I didn't object. Do we object sometimes to things like that? Who do we think of as common or unclean people? Who is it that makes us hesitate and object to talking to them? Unfortunately, as much as we might like to say, well, I don't have that problem, probably we do. We struggle with that concept. So Cornelius tells him the story, and Peter begins eventually to give his message. This is down in verses 34 and 35. So Peter opened his mouth and said, truly I understand that God shows no partiality. He gets it. Yay. Right? God's not showing that. But in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. And Peter tells him the story of the gospel of Jesus. The Holy Spirit falls on Cornelius and all those in the household, and there's confirmation. He believes and is baptized. Now, what I didn't mention earlier is that when Peter goes to visit Cornelius, he takes people with him. I think it's 6 people with him who are Jews. I'm impressed by his ability to convince them to go into the house of Cornelius. Just let me say that. But they're there as witnesses that these things happened and the truth of what happened. So they see these things, and even Peter asked them, who says they can't be baptized now? They understood that God is showing the approval for Cornelius and what happens. So Peter gets it, right? Goes back to Jerusalem. In the Acts, the 11th chapter, verses 2 and 3, when Peter gets back, it says, so when Peter went up to Jerusalem, the circumcision party criticized him, saying, you went to uncircumcised men and ate with them. I don't know. Did Peter roll his eyes at that point? I hope not, because this is a struggle for him. And he takes the time to explain everything that happened and show that God approved of this salvation. The reason I'm showing this, or talking about this, is it shows how hard it is for us to receive others. Peter didn't want to do it, and now the uncircumcised party is struggling with it. It's necessary that they do these things and learn these things. I also feel like I just missed a point. I have to go back a little bit. No, I didn't yet. Verse 12. Acts 11, verse 12, in the explanation. Okay. And then, yes, he's talking about those coming from Caesarea. He says, and the Spirit told me to go with them, those men, making no distinction. These 6 brothers also accompanied me, and we entered the man's house. Now Peter uses a different word. He said, the Spirit said, don't hesitate. Peter says, I didn't object. And now he says, the Spirit told him, don't make a distinction. What distinction would they have made? Jew, Gentile, right? Jews good, Gentiles not worthy of hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I came without making a distinction. Tell me, are these not the problems we also face of hesitation, objection, and making distinctions? And that's for those outside the church. Sometimes it's even for us inside the church that we do this to each other. We hesitate to receive each other. We object to fully welcoming each other. We make distinctions between us and them. And those are very nebulous things, and I'm going to leave it that way. But we make those distinctions, don't we? Here's the key point. Cornelius is saved because Peter overcame that. So let's go to Galatians, the 2nd chapter. This is several years down the road. In Galatians, the 2nd chapter, and we're going to be in the 2nd chapter, verse 11, if you look there with me. Peter comes to Antioch because Paul and Barnabas have been there. They've been doing a great work in Antioch. Peter comes to be with them, and Paul says, I had to oppose him because he stood condemned. In verse 12, this is what he says. In verse 12 he says, for before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles, but when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like the Jews? Now, as we read that picture, we see these Christians joined together at these tables eating together. They're Jew, they're Gentile, Peter and Barnabas and other Jews, they're all eating it together, right? We often join with Paul in saying Peter was a hypocrite when he separated himself. That was hypocrisy. And boy, Paul laid into him. Good job, Paul, right? I want you to consider, so that's the problem Peter has, right? He was supposed to have learned that lesson, Acts 10, but he didn't, or he didn't learn it well enough. Consider for a moment how the Gentiles who were sitting there eating together with Peter and Barnabas and the rest of the Jews, how did they feel when Peter got up and moved and sat with the other Jews? And when Barnabas did it, and when Jew after Jew after Jew, I don't know how many there were, they kept leaving. How do you think they felt about that? I mean, I don't know their hearts. Maybe some of them felt dejection, certainly rejected. We'll never be good enough for the Jews, will we? If Peter doesn't accept us, how's God going to accept us? He's one of the apostles. Maybe some reacted with anger, maybe some were sad, but it had to be a struggle for those Gentiles when Peter and Barnabas and the others separated themselves. Can you imagine what that would feel like? Have you had someone walk away from you that way? It hurts. It hurts. Receiving people is harder than we think it is. That's what Peter reminds us of. Really receiving. Jesus said, receive this child. Receiving each other is harder than we think it is. I want you to remind you of what happened with Jesus in Matthew the 11th chapter. In Matthew the 11th chapter, verses 16 through 19, Jesus talks about how the people of his generation are reacting in contrast between John the Baptizer and between Jesus. And he says, you guys are like children who are crying out. We played the flute and you didn't dance, and we sang a dirge and you didn't mourn. And they say, for John came neither eating nor drinking. They said, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. They say, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is justified by her deeds. Jesus did eat with a lot of people that were not approved of. I mean, he ate with a lot of people they approved of. He ate with his disciples and with their families. He ate with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. But he also ate with people they didn't approve of. I guess they wouldn't have included themselves in that group, but the Pharisees, he ate with them. Even though, from Jesus' perspective, were they wrong? Were they sinful? Matthew 23 would make that pretty clear. They had some problems. They were constantly testing Jesus. But Jesus would go in and he would associate with them. He would receive them. He ate with Samaritans. Most of the Jews would not have done that. He fed crowds of 5,000 and 4,000, and surely within those great big crowds, there were some people in there who were not necessarily good people. He did eat with tax collectors, and he did eat with sinners. Why is Jesus being rebuked for eating with the wrong people? Because in their mind, eating with someone, even entering the house of someone, is considered acceptance of them and acceptance of their sin. Remember, that's not the law, that's their reasoning. It's important that we keep that distinction in mind, that they struggle with that. I want to use two examples of people Jesus ate with to consider. One of them is the passage that Julian read for us earlier in Luke, the 7th chapter, where a Pharisee asks Jesus over, invites him over to his house, and it said, we're told in verse 36, he reclines at table with them, and he's eating with this Pharisee. And then the woman comes in, a woman who Luke says in the text is a sinner. That's not someone's opinion at that point. That's Luke giving us from the Spirit what kind of woman this is. She goes in, and what does she do? She cries, dries his feet, washes them, anoints them with oil. That's amazing. And the Pharisee who had invited Jesus thought to himself, if this man were really a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is. And this kind of woman who's touching her, because she's a sinner. And the point that he's making in his head is, he must not be a prophet, because a prophet would never let this woman touch him. Because if she touched him, that makes him unclean. It makes him impure. So just because of that. So if he's a prophet and he wants to stay pure, he would separate himself from it. That was his thought. So Jesus tells a little story about two debtors, one that owed a lot of money and one that owed a little money. And it's clear from the parable that he tells that the one who owes a lot is the woman who's the sinner, and the one who owes a little is Simon the Pharisee. In other words, Jesus in that parable is making really clear to Simon, you're a sinner too. Both of them are forgiven. So they both were in this condition of being sinful. And so when Jesus makes the application down in verse 44, he draws the contrast between what the woman did and what Simon did. When Simon invited Jesus to his house, he didn't receive Jesus with normal hospitality. He didn't wash his feet. He didn't kiss him as a way of greeting. He didn't anoint his head. The woman did all of these things. She showed an extreme acceptance of Jesus by her tears wetting his feet, drying his feet with her hair, kissing his feet, anointing his feet. She did so much more than he did. Now, here you have Jesus choosing to eat with a Pharisee who's intentionally inhospitable. Intentionally. Is Jesus receiving the Pharisee? The Pharisee's not really receiving him, but Jesus is there. He's right there with him. The Pharisee is choosing to make it really clear that he doesn't accept Jesus. In fact, throws those two accusations at him. The first accusation is, if he were a prophet, he would know. The second one comes a little bit later in the conversation when Jesus turns to the woman and says, your faith has made you well, your sins are forgiven. And what is the second thought the man and those who were with him had? Who is this guy to forgive sins? They were looking for reasons to condemn Jesus. Even with all that, they reject him in that way. And what is Jesus doing? He's teaching. He's receiving. He's trying to help them. He's there because he wants to save their souls. Was that true for the woman? Undoubtedly. Was it true for Simon the Pharisee? It was. He received him. What an example for us. But as I said, it's not easy. Let's go to the book of Matthew. Look at the second example. By the way, what that shows us is that Jesus demonstrates his mercy, his love, his acceptance for this woman, doesn't it? Your faith has made you well. Go. All right, Matthew, the 9th chapter. This is when Jesus calls Matthew. Now, Matthew's a tax collector, and just in case you're not aware of it, the problem that the Jews had with tax collectors that made them, in their minds, so evil is that they considered them traitors to the Jewish nation. They were collecting taxes for the Roman government, so they considered them traitors. So when you see tax collectors and sinners, it's because they're both bad. And that's the idea. So Jesus chooses, this has to be on purpose, chooses Matthew, a tax collector, to be one of his disciples. And Matthew decides, I guess, we're not given really the complete context, but he's going to throw a party, right? He's going to have a feast in welcoming Jesus. So in verse 10, Matthew 9, verse 10, and as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors, sinners, came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. What a beautiful picture of all these people joining together, enjoying this meal together. Jesus is with them, tax collectors, sinners. Jesus at no point pulls the Peter thing and says, oh, nope, there's a sinner. I'm out of here. He doesn't do that. He stays there and he's eating with them. When the Pharisees saw this, They called the disciples aside and they said, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, why do you think they asked that question? Were they genuinely concerned? Maybe. But I tend to think it was more of an accusation, don't you? That this was an accusation that Jesus is doing something wrong. And if Jesus is doing something wrong, we don't need to listen to what he's saying. We don't need to listen to what he's teaching. Jesus is accepting these men who are tax collectors and sinners, and in their opinion, he should not have been. So I think that's what they're asking. Jesus hears that, and he answers them. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Jesus doesn't deny that he's eating with people who are less than what they ought to be. He also makes it clear that he's exactly where he needs to be. That's a real struggle for us. He doesn't walk away like Peter. He recognizes that he's there to save souls, and these are souls that need to be saved. And if they're going to be saved, he's going to eat a meal with them. Now, is he just eating? I don't think that's what he was just enjoying. He was teaching, wasn't he? That's what he did all the time. And so he says to those Pharisees, "You go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." That's a sharp rebuke. Hosea, the 6th chapter, verse 6 is where that's from. Hosea is with the northern tribe. Israel has fallen completely into idolatry. They're worshiping God in the sense that they're offering sacrifices, but they're doing it very ritualistically. They're just going through the motions. They didn't care about anything beyond that. They didn't try to live correctly before God. So they worshiped, but it wasn't genuine from the heart kind of worship. And it's not just that they were sinning. I mean, he talks about murder and theft and injustice that was going on. But it was also that they weren't doing things that were right. And in particular, mercy. They weren't showing mercy. They had confused worship and outward obedience with righteousness and character. And as the context goes on to say, they were not faithful to God. They would get all of that. They would know the context of what Jesus is saying there when he says, "Go and learn what this means." It's from their own scriptures. There was a lesson there they should have learned. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So Jesus points them to this passage. Are the Pharisees guilty of the same thing as ancient Israel? They absolutely are. They cared more about their own self-derived rules than about the souls of those who were lost. They cared more about their own purity than about helping people who needed help. They considered their purity more important than anyone else. And here's Jesus. And what is Jesus determined to do? He's going to show mercy. And he wasn't afraid to get dirty doing it. I use that intentionally. In their eyes, he was unclean. He got in where he needed to be so that people could be saved. He received them. He got into the company of those who, as we're going to see, he describes as sick and sinners, and he engaged with them. Learn this. Jesus is saying it to every one of us. This is the picture of receiving that child onto the lap. Learn to show mercy. Those who are outside, those who are inside, learn to choose to show mercy. Beware of making excuses for not being merciful. Jesus ends by saying, "For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." He tells them exactly why he's there. He's right where he needs to be because he's dealing with people who are in sin. I'm here to save these people. What are you doing? What were they doing? They were condemning the sinners, just like the Pharisee did with that woman. They were judging the tax collectors. They were looking at them, and they were just judging and condemning, and Jesus was choosing to do what was right. Understand, in their eyes, he was doing something unlawful. Right? So here's our caveat we always have to remember. He didn't give in to the unjust criticism of others, but also we can't do something sinful to save others. I mean, there's a valid point there, right? But really, with that caveat, what is Jesus saying? Show mercy. Show mercy to these people instead of the judgment. So Matthew, the 18th chapter. When Jesus in this passage tells us, whoever receives one such a child in my name receives me, what is he teaching us? So we have to become like that child, first of all. Every one of us has to make that choice. If I'm going to go to heaven, I have to turn and become a child. I have to be humble. And once I'm in that place, I'm his child, aren't I? And as that child, I have to receive other children. It's children receiving children. We receive them in his name. But I think like Peter and like the Pharisees and the other Jews, we really struggle with this receiving others. That picture that we all have in our mind of Jesus, kind of on the ground holding a child on his lap, that looks so easy, doesn't it? There's a cute little kid coming over, sit on my knee. This is great. But when we get down to the practice of what Jesus did, it was hard work, and he was constantly being criticized for doing exactly this. It's hard for us to receive each other because we hesitate and we object and we discriminate. We make distinctions, not things that God does. We do it. We expect those we receive to be essentially without sin, without problems. We want them to be obviously righteous, and then we accept them. Of course, those are all our definitions, right? Just like the Jews did. We only receive and welcome and associate with them if they meet very stringent conditions that we've set up. But that's us, and that's not God's law. And we even quote passages to justify this. We interpret them to mean that we are to stay away from certain people. Just like the Jews use passages like that in the Old Testament, we still use them. What does 1 Corinthians 15:33 say? Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. We all know that one, right? How many of you, when you were a kid, heard that from your parents? Bad company ruins good morals. And what were they telling you? Stay away from bad people. We turn to 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, and verse 17. Therefore, go out from their midst and separate yourselves from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you. That welcome, by the way, is the same word that's used for Jesus in Matthew 18 for receive. Just so you know. We look at those passages and we say, well, we are to separate from everyone and hold everyone at arm's length, aren't we? Understand that in the context of those passages, both of those statements are about us getting our own lives right before God. Us getting our own lives right before God. It's Jesus who shows us the right example of choosing to be with people who were known to be sinners and who were known to be sick and who needed to hear the gospel and the truth. And they needed association and help. And so he went in and he was with them. Children receiving children. It implies that neither of us is mature or fully what we should be. That sometimes I'm sick and that sometimes you're a sinner. Whichever way you want to work that. And yet, it's imperative in those situations that we follow this example of Jesus. Receive the child. Because that's like receiving Jesus. And this demands that we show mercy. Go and learn what this means. That's what Jesus did to the woman washing his feet. The Pharisee didn't show her any mercy. He didn't even show Jesus mercy. But we need to show mercy like Jesus did to that woman. Like Jesus did with the tax collectors and the sinners that were gathered in Matthew's house. Go and learn what this means. Show mercy. If you go on in Matthew 18, he makes the last part of that point. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me, but whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. That's quite a warning, isn't it? His warning is that if we don't receive people, the danger of not receiving one another, like Jesus is that we might cause them to sin. You see, that's what I saw happening with Peter when he was in Antioch and he drew away from that table of the Gentiles. How many of them thought, if I'm not good enough for Peter, I'm out? Maybe zero. I don't know. But it could be that discouragement led people into sin. Be careful. The Pharisees did this. Jesus condemned them for it in Matthew the 23rd chapter and verse 13. He said, you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces because you don't go in yourself and you won't let them go in. If we fail to receive the child, if we fail to receive one another, we may be actually leading them into sin. And that's going to be on us. We won't enter the kingdom of heaven. So there's some really important lessons to learn from Jesus here today, aren't there? Our desire, like his, needs to be that we're going to save souls. And to save souls, we're going to receive our fellow children. We're going to be merciful to those who are sinners and those who are sick. We're going to commend the faith of those who are struggling. You know, Jesus did that for the woman, right? You heard that part. He commended her faith. Not the Pharisees. He commended the faith of the woman who was struggling. Sometimes other people are going to be critical of our choices because we don't follow their rules. Doesn't matter. We're going to do what we need to do to receive each other. So be careful. Learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Let's receive each other. If there's anyone here who's not a child of God, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ and you're ready to confess that he is Lord and be baptized, we're ready for that. If you need our prayers and help, please come forward as we stand and sing.